Potential is a word that I would use to describe Ahmed Johnson, the man who came into the WWF in 1995 and was seen by peers and Vince McMahon as a huge star in the making. Johnson had every physical tool imaginable of a top attraction for the WWF, standing at 6'2" and weighing 305 pounds and chiseled to the absolute gills. Johnson was simply built like an action figure. Needless to say, he had the frame of a bodybuilder that would infatuate Vince McMahon. The infatuation was enough to make him Intercontinental Champion shortly after his debut, and to pair him up with the company's biggest star at the time, Shawn Michaels. After a brief stint that lasted 3 years in the WWF, Johnson was gone from the company and eventually would wind up in WCW for a cup of coffee, and then he would retire from the ring by 2003 after doing a few independent shows. However, his career has remained in the forefront of discussion within a certain portion of wrestling fans thanks to claims made by him and his peers. Johnson has been the topic of much scrutiny, while Johnson himself has gone on to make interesting allegations about the likes of Steve Austin, Farooq, and WWE management, among others. In this video, I will offer my analysis on the WWF career of Ahmed Johnson and uncover those wild allegations. Ahmed Johnson debuted on the October 23rd, 1995 episode of Monday Night Raw, with his pay-per-view debut at Survivor Series just weeks later. Johnson was teamed up with some of the company's top babyfaces at Survivor Series, Shawn Michaels, Sid, and the British Bulldog, thus showing how favorably the Office viewed him. By King of the Ring in June, Johnson had pinned Goldust to become the Intercontinental Champion, the first black Intercontinental Champion in company history at that, just 8 months after his debut. At the time, the Intercontinental Championship meant much more than it has over the past 10 to 15 years. Guys like Macho Man and Shawn Michaels won the title shortly before becoming main event players and huge stars. Clearly the writing on the wall was there for Johnson, and all he had to do was grab the ball and run with it. He tag teamed with Michaels for a short time prior to the July 22nd episode of Raw. This famed episode of Raw is where Johnson would have his career and life changed forever. Ron Simmons, college football player and former WCW champion, made his debut on this episode and kicked Ahmed so hard in the torso that it allegedly injured his kidneys. This injury halted his momentum and caused Johnson to miss 4 months of action. Some will dispute whether this injury was from Farooq being stiff or if it was just other natural health issues that Johnson went through. Upon his return though, Johnson would feud with Farooq and the newly formed Nation of Domination, and then would eventually join them. During this time, he interacted with several top talents like Steve Austin and Undertaker, but ultimately nothing of note materialized for the big man. He floundered for much of 1997 and early 1998 before leaving the WWF after No Way Out in February of 98. Now, I literally summed up Johnson's entire WWF career in less than 5 minutes for you. So I know you're probably wondering why I'm making a video on him if there is such little substance on his career. Well, here is where things get interesting. Apparently, Johnson had a very eventful 2.5 years within the WWF. In the years since his retirement, he has done a number of interviews and made a bunch of ridiculous claims, some of which might be true, some of which might be false. I don't really know since I wasn't there. I do know that these claims have been shot down by a multitude of personalities, most of which, when asked about Johnson in interviews, don't have particularly positive things to say about him. The wildest claim of all is one that Johnson made about the Rattlesnake, a top 5 merch mover for the WWE in 2023, Stone Cold Steve Austin, everybody's favorite redneck. During a shoot interview, Ahmed Johnson told the host that someone had wrote a racial slur on his rental car shortly after he won the Intercontinental Championship. Johnson went on to claim that he believed it was Stone Cold Steve Austin that committed this heinous act because, quote, a fan told him that he saw Austin in the parking lot by his car, and because of Austin's role in the movie The Longest Yard. So Johnson is basing his claim that could defame the legacy of Steve Austin on an acting role in a movie, a role that he was given lines to say by the producers of a Hollywood film. Now, if you haven't seen The Longest Yard, Steve Austin, he plays a coach for a football team or like a trainer or something like that. And he says, some interesting slurs. He has an interesting dialogue in the movie. I'll let you guys look that one up. I'm not going to say what he said or anything like that. But it's interesting. Now, not only that, Johnson also based these claims off of a fan telling him that he saw Austin in the parking lot. Yeah, that's pretty interesting to say the least. He's basing Austin's real life background and his real life beliefs on the back of a movie role, and because some person said he saw Steve Austin in a parking lot. Austin later spoke to Mark Henry about this and the incident on an episode of his podcast, The Steve Austin Show. Henry and Austin spoke at length about Johnson, which I'll get into in a moment. They ended that conversation, though, with Henry saying that he absolutely did not believe that the incident took place and said that Austin is the last possible guy that could be called a racist in the wrestling business. The bulk of the conversation between Austin and Henry about Ahmed was centered around the infamous beef between Ahmed Johnson and Ron Simmons. Henry told a story about how Johnson kicked Simmons in the ribs and lacerated his liver, which cost him 9 months of his career. In retaliation, Henry stated that when Simmons returned, he shot on Johnson and broke 3 of his ribs, alleging that this beating resulted in Johnson leaving the WWF. And Henry went on to say that Ron Simmons basically ran Johnson out of the company, which is nuts to me. The hits kept coming from Henry. He even stated that Johnson slipped 2 somas in his water at a restaurant. For those of you who don't know, somas are a dangerous pain medication that can leave one incoherent for hours. I did some digging, and I could not find any footage of the alleged beating that Johnson took at the hands of Simmons. Now, I'm not saying that it didn't happen. I just can't seem to find any evidence of it, and the timeline of their feud just doesn't add up. Johnson did admit to injuring Simmons during a street fight at WrestleMania 13. However, the two were a part of the Nation of Domination a few short months later. Johnson did miss some time with an injury in late '97, but there's not much detail out about that. During an interview, Johnson answered the question as to what occurred that made him want to leave the WWF. He said that his sister was terminally ill with cancer in early '98, and he had to tend to her during that time, so he took a few days off to do so. Prior to doing so, Johnson was booked in an angle to be beaten up by the Truth Commission, and Johnson claimed that he was told that he was going to be lynched and dragged up the ramp by the faction. Let that sit in. Ahmed Johnson is alleging that Vince McMahon, Vince Russo, and the WWF's creative team wanted Ahmed Johnson to be lynched on live TV. Maybe we've seen some crazy things, especially during that time in the Attitude Era, so I wouldn't put it past the WWF to do this, but man, that is an outrageous claim, one that seemingly has no credibility with peers, because Booker T called him a liar, while Mark Henry called him a bad example of how a black man should conduct themselves in the WWF. Johnson claimed that he would not do the angle while his sister was terminally ill. He did not want her to watch her brother being treated that way on TV right before she passed, so he walked out of the WWF. Now, why did Ahmed Johnson never make it in the WWE? That is a question that has confused some for the better part of 2 decades. Seemingly, Johnson lacked the wherewithal from a political standpoint to make it as a top star. He rubbed several members of the locker room the wrong way, according to recounts made by Jim Cornette and D'Lo Brown. D'Lo Brown once told a story about the time that he got into a fight with Johnson in catering. Brown does a hilarious impression of Johnson and said that he never saw anyone that Vince wanted to make a star and give money to more than Johnson, and Johnson simply did not capitalize on it. The fight with D'Lo was an embarrassment for Johnson as D'Lo put him in a headlock and held him in it while laughing at him. Cornette said that Johnson was full of himself and was stiff in the ring, so the other wrestlers did not want to deal with him. Certainly these tales tell you all that you need to know about why Johnson never became a star. He just didn't get the business, is how The Godfather put it. Once he walked around the locker room saying that he was going to defeat Mark Calloway for the WWF title, and when D'Lo Brown asked him if Vince told him that, Johnson just responded by saying, why wouldn't he put the title on me? It sounds to me that a disconnect from reality, lack of in-ring skills, and inability to get along with the locker room are what doomed the WWF career of Ahmed Johnson. If you go back and watch his matches, which I don't really recommend you do, you'll see that there wasn't really any substance behind his impressive physique and charisma. Ahmed Johnson is a great example of what can happen when the WWF and Vince McMahon think they have a megastar on their hands, only for that plan to turn out as poorly as possible. Nowadays, Johnson keeps himself relevant in the wrestling space by doing autograph signings and other appearances like conducting shoot interviews. He had really let himself go in recent years, but in a more recent interview stated he is losing weight and getting back into shape. Now this has been another edition of Wrestling Uncovered, and I'll leave you with this. What did you make of Ahmed Johnson? Were you a fan? Tell me your thoughts on him below, and thank you so much for watching.